If you follow this sort of news, you probably already know there is a new mod chip for the Nintendo GameCube called the Raspberry Pi Picoboot. It is developed by WebHDX. He is a very active and innovative member of the modding community. Now, whether you've heard of it or not, today I am your cool Uncle Marissa, and I am here to show you one way of installing it, go over some of the pros and cons, who it's for, and all that cool kind of stuff. So let's take a quick look into the recent history of GameCube modding. The main thing that people have been using has been the Xeno chip, or the Xeno mod, the Xeno GC. It's a little mod chip that you solder onto the board right below the disk drive. Now, what does it do? It allows you to play homebrew games. It allows you to play game backups, also known as ROMs, and it allows you to make your disk drive region free. I've installed several of these Xeno GC mod chips, and for the most part, I seem to have more luck with quick solder boards, which means you just solder the board directly onto the board as opposed to using wires. But what are the pros and cons of the Xeno, and why do we need a new one? So that was my question, of course, when I heard about Picoboot. So first off, Xeno GC works in the same way that Picoboot does with an application called Swiss. Swiss is a homebrew application. It's a lot like, other custom firmware homebrew applications, like for example, Twilight Menu for DS. And essentially what it allows you to do is to enact all of the mods. So you use it to run those homebrew ROMs, etc. And the way that Swiss has been booted through the Xeno mod is either through an SD Gecko, which is a memory card, but instead it has a slot for an SD card, or through the SD to SP2 port, which if you have a DOL001 model GameCube, it has a port at the bottom, and you would put this little guy in, and you have your ROMs and everything stored in that micro SD card. Now there's one more component of booting Swiss from the Xeno chip, and that is you would generally boot it through a disk. So there are specific Swiss disks that just run Swiss. There's also ways of doing an exploit, for example, through a save file. Essentially all you need to know is that in one way or another you would be using your disk drive. And that, for me, is where the biggest difference comes from the Picoboot, is that the Picoboot does not require a disk to run Swiss. And that's amazing because ultimately it's going to extend the longevity of your disk drive on your GameCube. And, I know there are people who just, once they mod their GameCube, they just don't use discs anymore. But I have like an attachment to physical things, like all of my consoles pretty much are modded, but I will still go out and buy physical games and play them. So it's always good for me to have that option. If you absolutely just want to get rid of the disk drive, there's also the GC loader where you replace the disk drive entirely. There's more information on that in other videos, but it is significantly more expensive than the Raspberry Pi Picoboot. The Picoboot is also great for if you do have a non-functioning disk drive, which, personally I would probably fix that. But if you just want to play games and don't want to invest any more time or money other than into the Picoboot itself, it's a great option. And I want to emphasize that the reason that I want to mod my GameCube with the Picoboot is just so that I can play games without using the disk drive, so I don't wear it out. Now this is important to keep in mind because the method that I'm going to show you today is how to install Picoboot using Angry Helder's quick solder board. And just a disclaimer on this method before we dive in. So the typical method that is shown in the Picoboot wiki and suggested by WebHDX is a wired method. Now Helder's method is a quick solder board that he's developed that goes on the IPL chip. Now, what do we need to know before we do this? I do know that Helder has spoken to WebHDX about this method and about the possibility of things like future updates. He states that if the Raspberry Pico gets an update, you can update it while it's still on the GameCube. Just got to be really fast so nothing overheats. And WebHDX has stated that he does not provide support for this method, which I don't take to mean he's against this method so much as if something goes wrong, he's not the one who's going to be able to help you, and he's not able to advocate for this method necessarily. So why am I choosing to do it anyway? Because again, I just don't want to wear out my disk drive. So quite frankly, I don't see myself updating this chip. I don't see myself really caring too much about new features. I just want a way to play backups of games without worrying about the disks. And at this point in time, Picoboot does that perfectly. So now that we are going to get started, what do we need to have? So obviously we need to have Angry Helder's Picoboot quick solder board. He has two options available. He has one with the Picoboot already soldered on, and he has one which is just the flex cable if you already have a Picoboot or you would like to purchase that on your own. I think that the pre-soldered version is a very fair price, and that is what I ended up going with. However, you will see me soldering the board on again, just to show you how that's done, and also for reasons that I will tell you at the end. What else? You need a security bit screwdriver for these really frustrating little octagonal hexagon, I don't remember, bits at the bottom of the GameCube. And just a note, when you buy one, make sure you get one that has a pretty long stem, because I have one that I got and it has a very short stem, so it actually doesn't reach into the pretty deep hole where those screws are. So I've ended up jerry-rigging something, but you know, better to do it right from the beginning. Otherwise, you just need basic Phillips screwdrivers. And of course, you will either need an SD to SB2 card, or you will need an SD Gecko, which you can also get from Angry Helder's website. He has his own version, an SD to GC. And that's actually what I went with, even though I already have an SD to SB2 card, because I realized if I want to keep changing it out with new stuff on the SD card, I don't really want to unscrew my Game Boy player every time to access that port. If you don't have a Game Boy player, the SB2 might be a better solution just because it's much more discreet and it doesn't take up a memory card slot on your GameCube. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's go ahead and first off download the files that we need to get started. We can go to the Picoboot wiki and access the installation guide for the latest firmware for the Raspberry Pi. So it is linked right here and you can download the latest release. Make sure beforehand that your SD card is formatted in FAT32. You can do this either with Windows, or if your SD card is too big, you can use the mini partition tool, which I've also linked in the description. Now we also need to grab Swiss, so I've linked to the Swiss GitHub as well, and you can download the compressed file for that there. I'm downloading the 7Z file. You can open that using 7-zip. This step is optional, but you'll want to do it if you have a Game Boy player. So Game Boy interface, you can download the main package, and if you'd like the extra package, which comes with things like borders for the Game Boy games that you're playing, just neat little customization features. Now there are 3 versions of GBI that you can download. There's the regular version, the speedrunning version, and the high fidelity edition. Chances are, if you're playing on a regular flat screen, you need the regular version. The speedrunning version is great for CRTs, which is the one that I downloaded. And of course, you can read more on the GBI wiki. All right, so now we have everything that we need in our downloads folder. So it's just a matter of extracting everything. And at this point, you can connect your Raspberry Pico to the computer. Just make sure you press and hold the only button on the board and connect it via micro USB. And it should show up on the sidebar. Now we can delete all the files we don't need, and picoboot.uft, the firmware, you can drag and drop that into the Picoboot. It should at that point just eject itself. Enter the Swiss folder, go to the DOL folder, and find the DOL file with the name and numbers, and just rename it ipl.dol and move that to the root of your SD card. We should also make a GBI folder in the root of our SD card, and pull whichever GBI app you want. You can use all three into that folder. And one cool thing you can do with this homebrew is if you rename the GBI DOL file with a button name and then move it to the root of your SD card, you can access it just by pressing and holding that button while you boot up your GameCube. And if you haven't already, go turn on your GameCube so it runs warm. This is going to help you later when we have to remove the heatsink. You're going to want to let it run 10 to 15 minutes or so. And make sure you drag and drop everything else that we downloaded for GBI into the GBI root folder, including those neat extras. You will also want to move MC Backup from the GBI folder onto your SD card to the root. And don't forget to make a folder on your SD card called ROMs or games or whatever so that you can put your game backups right there. And of course we also have the Swiss folder down there. You basically pull Swiss onto your SD card as well. So how to solder the Pico board onto Helder's flex cable. So make sure you have the flex cable down with some Kapton tape so it doesn't move, and put some flux on all the pads that need to be soldered on so that we can tin these pads. Now, a really nice thing about this board is all of the square pads, those are all ground pads. So you can solder as many of those as you like, there's no harm. But on the back, there are some arrows which Helder has printed so that you know which pads you have to solder. So now I'm just pre-tinning after applying flux, double checking the arrows so I know that I'm working on the correct pads. Now once we put the Pico board on, you're going to want to anchor it, and the pad at the top is a really great place to start. Now I'm also adding flux to the Pico board. I'm not as troubled with it because I did use this board once on a different flex cable, so it kind of is already pre-tinned. Once you are all done soldering to the cable, you can use a multimeter just to check the connection between the pads and the board. You just set your multimeter to continuity mode and it should make a beep sound. I did this off camera, but I don't want to keep any secrets from you guys, so. And once we're all finished soldering the Pico board, it is time to disassemble. So there are only 4 security bits, which is nice, and you can unscrew those. They're in pretty deep, so you can also unscrew them, leave them in, and then later flip the GameCube and lift the top. Just make sure you have your hands protecting the GameCube, or you're working somewhere with edges, otherwise they will roll. All right, so we're flipping the cube, and there they go. I like to keep a little bowl. I used to keep an ice tray when I was less familiar with where the different screws went, and I recommend that you can number each tray and then have a little guide. Once we're inside, pop off the front panel. Just be careful, there is a ribbon cable there. And just lay it in front. And you can also pop off the back panel. That doesn't have anything, so you can put it to the side. And now we have a billion different screws holding the disk drive and everything down. Now this is not necessary, but I have my controller port cover painted and I just realized that and I didn't want to get it scratched up or scuffed up. So there are a few screws in that little board that you can take out. They're very easy to take out, and then you'll be able to pop the controller port cover off of that board. Again, be mindful of the ribbon cable. Now when you thought you got all the bajillion screws, you gently lift the fan, very gently, and surprise, there's 3 more screws for you. Congratulations. The last screws that we need to remove from this layer are the 2 little shields on top of the memory card slots. These use a slightly smaller Phillips screw than the rest of the body, and they are very long, so you won't forget where they belong. And now it's time to lift everything up. Now be very careful here because the disk drive is slotted in. I'll show you. Now we go for the heatsink. So the heatsink also has very unique screws. You can see they have a little nut around them. And once we're all done, just wiggle the heatsink until it comes off. Now I do hope you took my advice and you did let your GameCube run a bit, because otherwise you could tear off some components if you pull off the heatsink. Now I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the old thermal paste. I technically don't need to because it came off so clean because I left it running, but it gives me a nice feeling to start anew. Before applying new thermal pads, we're going to clean up the mess with isopropyl alcohol, some Q-tips, and cotton pads. And now we can install the Picoboot after we have come so far. So apply flux to the legs of the IPL chip. There's also a 3M strip that I've removed and stuck down to help. And then I'm going to pre-tin the flex cable. Obviously be very careful not to press down if you're going to pre-tin the same way I am. You can also pre-tin on a different surface, which is probably safer. So now I'm using my ceramic tipped tweezers to hold down the flex cable while I solder. Be really precise with this step, okay? Make sure you don't bridge any of the legs on the IPL chip. You can do this by pre-tinning with using flux and also pull motions, okay? Don't poke. So pull down from the chip leg onto the flex board, and you can also gently do vice versa to create those connections. Be very gentle. I'm using a pointed tip here on my soldering iron, which is immensely helpful. Then take out your multimeter, put it on continuity mode. That's the sound it'll make when there is continuity. So I'm just going to check to make sure that all of the legs are making contact with the flex board contacts. You can also check to make sure that the IPL chip legs are not bridged. You should have continuity on legs 4 and 5 on the top, but otherwise nowhere else. That was 4 and 5. I'm going to add the bigger pads that I cut down now. I'm also going to throw up some information on what the thickness of each pad needs to be. Put the heatsink on, click the disk drive into place, and then you can go and test it. And you should see Swiss come up and see all your folders and everything if it works. So if it works, great. We are going to reassemble. If it doesn't work, use a multimeter, check the connections on the IPL chip and check the connections on your Pico board. So I'm going to just clean up the flux on the IPL chip with some isopropyl alcohol. I also already did do this off screen on the Picoboot board itself. We're going to screw the heatsink back on. We're going to put the disk drive back on. So that right there needs to click into that slot. It's quite satisfying. Next, I'm going to put those little shields back on. They only actually sit one way, so don't worry about putting them on backwards. Then I'm just gonna put those bazillion screws back so that I know where they go, and that way I can just speed through them and screw them down. Just don't forget that on the fan side, the very top and bottom, they go through the fan, so don't put those in quite yet. And we can put our little port cover back, screw our fan in. Once everything's in order, you can flip it over and stick the game bit screws back in. I'm also going to go ahead and reinstall my Game Boy player. And you can use a flathead screwdriver to tighten those screws. You can also, I think, use a coin. I feel like in the 90s, that was such a thing of, you know, you can use a coin to unscrew this thing that will need to be unscrewed frequently. Like battery cameras, also, you would use a coin. And now for the final show. So as a test, I'm gonna boot up Pikmin. It boots up super fast. And it runs great. And remember, if you are using the GC to SD or an SD Gecko, keep it in slot B, because games will often need slot A memory card for their saves, and they won't let you continue if it's not in slot A. And here's a little demo of GBI. So as you remember, I set it to launch with B, so I'm gonna press and hold B, and then I'm gonna go and turn on the GameCube. All right, and it automatically launches into Game Boy Player, and because I downloaded the extras, I have that cute little frame as well. It booted super quick. It's playing super smooth. Really nice. Alright, so we are all done with this mod, which is really exciting because I kind of went through it with this. But before I get into that, what are the pros and cons? So let's first just focus on the Picoboot itself. The pros are that it doesn't use the disk drive. I mean, how amazing is that? I think that that's just It's so good because part of the reason that I like to run ROMs on some disk-based systems is so that I can increase the longevity of the disk drive, and the Picoboot helps do just that. Furthermore, it is fast. It is new, which is a pro. I think that, we've been with the Xeno mod chip for so long that I kind of didn't expect there to be anything new, but here we are. And if you're the type of person who likes to adopt new features as they roll out, then it seems like there are going to be plenty to come with the Picoboot. The cons of the Picoboot itself, I think the only real con is that it is definitely more of a hassle to install than the Xeno mod chip is. The wired method seems to be rather fussy. For example, I hear if the wires are too long, you will have issues. If you want to keep things clean, you might have to get a 3D printed bracket for it. And then even Helder's version, while it is much easier, in my opinion, you're still dealing with a pretty tricky area of the board. If you damage the IPL chip, you kind of need a new motherboard. And now for the pros and cons of the mod we specifically did with Helder's quick solder board. So pros, in my opinion, it's much easier than the wired method. You are able to mount it easily with the 3M strips he's included, and everything just falls into place pretty perfectly. You can also get the flex cable pre-soldered with a board, which is very convenient. It gives you fewer things you have to double check if anything does go wrong. In terms of the cons, it seems to be a little iffy around whether it's going to be super possible or even just simple to do updates if they roll out. There doesn't seem to be any update so far that would necessitate viewing this installation method as a risk. It's just a very, but it might happen in the future. But this method is perfect for someone who really just wants everything the Xeno chip does, but without the disk drive. Because it already comes stock with all of that, you don't need to update anything. Now, another issue with this mod, and honestly, this applies to any mod where you have to solder something onto the motherboard. While it may look simple, it may look straightforward, the instructions might look clear, it's going to be dangerous. You do need to know how to solder well, because what happened with me is I haven't soldered in a really long time, to be honest. I went into this really weird place at one point this last year where I was just fixing everything and modding everything, and then when I calmed down, I took a break from all of this for a while. And so all that to say, I did end up damaging the IPL chip on my motherboard, and it was pretty devastating. So I had to just get a new motherboard entirely, which was not a cost that this low-cost mod had me considering when I went out to start it. And this time around, I just got the flex board from Helder, and I soldered the Picoboot. I desoldered it off the original cable and put it onto the new one, and everything was perfect this time around. But be careful with that, and be careful also with the points on the flex cable. It's a very thin cable, so if you apply too much heat to it or too little, the contacts on the flex board will come off. Not a good time. So make sure that you're confident in your soldering skills before you do this, or if you are confident, just make sure you're all brushed up, because I was not, and that was not good. But on the plus side, now my original GameCube had a Japanese motherboard, and now it has an English motherboard, so that's pretty awesome. Yeah, that's about it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you tried the Picoboot? Have you tried the regular installation or Helder's? And once again, thank you so much for watching. I wish you so much success if you try this mod. The GameCube is such an adorable and fun console, and I'm so happy that there's a new mod for it. I think a big reason that it's kind of neglected is because you can easily mod a Wii and play GameCube games on there, but it's not as cute. Once again, I've been your cool Uncle Marissa, and I hope you'll stop by again soon.